Hello, 5th grade. This is Mrs. Taranja with the Citizenship Academy. We are on Domain 6, the Reformation, and this is Lesson 1, the Power of Shared Ideas. Our objectives for today are to identify the setting and chronology of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and Reformation, and read informational text to explain those significance of the Church. And we're also going to listen to the informational text to describe the Reformation as compared with the earlier time periods and explain how the Gutenberg press influenced this period's shift. Some key vocabulary for today's lesson are approach, a method of handling or solving something; argue, to give reasons for or against something; argument, a statement or reasons for or against something; common is shared or belonging to two or more individuals, groups of people or ideas; and relationship is the way in which people or groups behave and interact with each other. So what is the Reformation? So our unit is called the Reformation, which is about a movement in the European history that came toward the end of the Renaissance. To reform means to form again or to change in order to improve or make something better, and it's the act of improving something or making something better. So this unit's going to focus on the time period in European history when some people decided that things needed to be fixed and changed and improved, and they actually took the steps in order to make those changes to make things better. The power of the church. So we're going to read an excerpt of a chapter that you actually read in grade 4 about the Middle Ages. It's called The Power of the Church, to just review some information about the Christian church during the Middle Ages. Now, during this part, you're actually going to read this independently, so feel free to pause the video at any time to read more thoroughly and clearly. Okay, now we are going to read the first chapter in our reader. This is called The Power of the Printed Word. Did you know that a man named John Gooseflesh changed the world? Johann Gensflesh, which is English for John Gooseflesh, was born in the city of Mainz, Germany, around 1397 CE. However, by the time Johann started school, he went by the name Gutenberg instead of Gensflesh, and that is the name we remember. Gutenberg was the name of the large manor house in which Johann grew up. He came from a very wealthy family. Johann was taught to read from an early age. Unlike the homes of less privileged children in the early 1400s, the Gutenberg house was full of books. That may not seem unusual, but it was. Books in the 1400s were very different from the books we have today. The book you are reading right now is a printed book. There are thousands of copies of this book, all exactly the same. They were printed by machines in a very short time. Not so with the books in Johann's day. Each book in Gutenberg's home library was one of a kind, rare, and expensive. Books in the Middle Ages. Throughout the Middle Ages, books were made by hand. Much of the writing was done by monks working in monasteries, although the craft of making books also took place in some universities and secular schools. Primarily, existing books such as the Bible and great works authored by ancient Greek and Roman scholars were copied. The monks painstakingly copied the text with pen and ink on thin sheets of parchment. It typically took monks many weeks or months to complete the pages of an entire book. The highest quality books were illustrated. This task was accomplished by a skilled artist called an illuminator. An illuminator decorated the pages with colorful ornate designs and small pictures. Bits of gold pounded very thin were applied to the pages of the most expensive books to make the text and illustrations shine. When the manuscript was finished, the final step was to bind the pages into a book. This was done by sewing them together along one side and then sandwiching them between wooden boards covered with cloth or leather. An enormous amount of time and effort went into creating each book. Only the wealthiest members of society, scholars, and church clergy could afford to own such treasures. Throughout the Middle Ages, of course, these were typically the only people who were able to read. Lead and letters. When Johann Gutenberg finished school, he went to work at the mint in Mainz. His father was in charge of the mint, which coined money for the city. Johann learned how to melt and cast metal in molds to form precise shapes. He liked working with metal and was skilled at metal casting. As Johann Gutenberg grew older and became a master metalsmith, he thought a lot about the growing demand for books. His experience working with metal gave him an idea. What if he cast letters out of the metal, such as lead? He could arrange those metal letters or pieces of type in lines to spell out words, make sentences, and create entire pages of text. By applying ink to the surface of the type and pressing paper onto it, he could print those pages. Gutenberg set out to try. First, he developed a way to pour melted lead into molds in the shape of letters of the alphabet. Each letter, piece of type, was cast as a mirror image of it, how it would look when printed. For example, the R was cast as a backwards R, and a C was cast as a backwards C. Gutenberg made many copies of each letter, both capital and lowercase, plus every punctuation mark. Because his collection of metal type was made up of individual pieces that could be moved around to form endless combinations of letters, it was called movable type. Gutenberg didn't truly invent movable type. The Chinese and Koreans had used a form of movable type hundreds of years earlier. He didn't invent printing either. Different printing techniques had also existed for centuries. In Europe, people had begun printing with ink on paper using blocks of wood. This technique, called woodblock or woodcut printing, began in 1400 CE. The surface of a block of wood was carved to create raised letters and images. Ink was then applied to the carved surface. Finally, the block was pressed onto paper to make a print. If you've ever pressed your thumb onto an ink pad and then touched to a paper, you've created a thumbprint in much the same way. Woodblock printing was a complex and time-consuming process. It wasn't much faster than copying pages of text by hand. What Johann Gutenberg did invent was a machine that greatly improved the process of printing with movable type. He may have gotten the idea for his press from a wine press, a machine used to press the juice out of grapes. Gutenberg's printing press worked in a similar way. Instead of squeezing grapes, though, his press squeezed paper against the ink surface of metal type to make a clear, dark imprint of words on paper. Once he had perfected both his metal type and his press, he was able to print, with help from a number of assistants, several hundred pages a day. Gutenberg's Bible. After experimenting with printing a few official documents and small, simple books of grammar, Gutenberg was ready to undertake a big project. He decided to print a large, beautiful Bible. He hoped to make a lot of money. Gutenberg started printing his Bible around 1450 CE. He may have cast more than 100,000 pieces of type for it. Several times during the process, he ran out of money and had to borrow more. He completed the first edition of roughly 180 copies of the Bible. The exact number isn't really known, in 1454 or 1455 CE. Gutenberg's Bible was the first large book printed with movable type, metal type, in Europe. The power of communication. Gutenberg didn't make much money from his Bible or his new printing press. But as you read at the beginning of this chapter, he did change the world. Gutenberg's printing press and the availability of inexpensive paper made it possible to produce many copies of books and documents quickly. This dramatically lowered the price of books and other printed materials. Suddenly, people had a way to distribute ideas and information from person to person and place to place much faster than ever before. Soon, printing presses just like Gutenberg's were producing hundreds and thousands of books in cities throughout Europe. At first, most of the books were printed in Latin, but it wasn't long before books were being printed in more familiar languages, including French, English, Italian, Spanish, and German. At this time, too, literacy, or the ability to read and write, increased across Europe. A growing middle class of merchants and craftsmen gained both wealth and influence. Learning to read and write became something more and more people wanted and needed to do. As a result, the demand for books increased. Books and other printed materials were more readily available for those people who could read. Today, you can walk into a library or bookstore and choose from thousands of books. You can download books from the internet to laptops, tablets, and phones. So you have to use your imagination to really appreciate just how big a change Gutenberg and his printing press brought about. Before Gutenberg, very few people have ever held, let alone read, a book. After Gutenberg, books were much more common. Gutenberg's printing press revolutionized communication, much like the internet revolutionized how people communicated in the second half of the 1900s. Although at not quite the same lightning speed, plentiful, affordable books opened the door to a whole new world of learning and ideas. Some people didn't like this turn of events, however. Some government officials worried. What if printing presses were used to spread ideas that weakened our power over the people? Some leaders of the Catholic Church thought, what if the presses were used to publish ideas that contradicted the Church's doctrine? But no one could stop the presses and the sudden flow of information and ideas. It is true to say that Gutenberg revolutionized communication, and just as some political and religious leaders feared, big changes certainly did lie ahead. Upper and lowercase. Have you ever heard someone call capital letters uppercase letters or small letters lowercase letters? These terms got their start in early printing shops like Gutenberg's. A person called a typesetter arranged the individual pieces of type into the whole block of type that would be printed to create a page of text. This person grabbed a piece of types from two boxes or cases, usually stacked one on top of the other. The uppercase held the capital letters, while the lowercase held the small letters. The names uppercase and lowercase caught on and have survived for more than 500 years. Parchment versus paper. The ancient Egyptians produced paper from the stems of the papyrus plant. Much later, the Chinese developed another way of producing paper. The Chinese method involved placing plant fibers in water to produce a pulp that could be pressed and dried into thin sheets. The art of paper making slowly made its way across Asia into Europe. By the 1200s, there were paper mills in Spain and Italy. In medieval Europe, paper was made primarily from linen rags. The rags were repeatedly soaked in water and beaten to create a pulp of tiny linen fibers. Paper makers dipped frames made of wire mesh into the pulp to create a thin layer of these fibers, forming a sheet of paper. The sheets were dried and pressed and sometimes polished with a smooth stone to create a soft, shiny surface. Compared to parchment, paper was lightweight and relatively inexpensive. Paper was often used for making small volumes of sermons and low-cost textbooks, whereas high-quality books were almost always produced using parchment. However, after the invention of the printing press, paper largely replaced parchment. Okay, so our word work for today is revolutionize. So in the chapter we read, it said Gutenberg's printing press revolutionized communication, much like the internet revolutionized how people communicated in the second half of the 1900s, although at not quite the same lightning speed. Revolutionize means to change completely, and this is actually a verb. So when we talk about revolutionizing, we're meaning changing everything. So Gutenberg's printing press changed all the ways in which communication took place. Now that is the end of today's lesson. Make sure you complete your assessment for this lesson. We will see everyone in lesson 2.